everyone will hear. Okay, well, fantastic. I would like to welcome our speaker tonight, who is Dr. Ron Baxter. He is an art historian who trained and worked at the Coulter Art Institute of Art. I knew I was going to stumble on that one for many years in various roles. He's also the research director of the Corpus of Romanesque Sculpture in Britain. But tonight he's going to talk about a topic I know he's published on, which is the rediscovery of Reading Abbey. So I will let you take it away, Ron, if you'd like to share your screen.
Okay, I would like to share my screen. I'd like to. Okay, can everybody hear me? Shall I begin?
Yes, that's great, Ron. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is why a rediscovery? Why a rediscovery? And it's a relatively recent one too. The standard works on the history of English medieval architecture, Clapham, Bowes, Webb, even Fernie, didn't have very much to say about the abbey and its church. Perhaps a guess about the plan of the eastern arm, a reference to monks from Cluny turning up, and something about the recent-ish discovery of some seriously good sculpture. The only monograph was written in 1901 by a Reading physician called Hurry, whose other main work was about woad, what you paint your face with. So it wasn't until the corpus of Romanesque sculpture was let loose on it in the 1990s that the story began to come together. And this is it. King Henry I founded Reading in 1121 to be a burial church for himself and his family. He was buried there, as was his queen, Adeliza, and several of his relatives and descendants. When the monastery was founded, Henry made sure it would be rich through generous grants of lands and a glorious collection of relics, bits of dead saints and souvenirs from the Holy Land that would attract the pilgrim trade. The Abbey Church was one of the biggest in England at the time, longer than any except Old St Paul's, Bury St Edmunds, Winchester and Norwich. Its position was on the main routes to the north and west, and successive medieval kings, right up to the time of Henry VIII, used it as a staging post on their itineraries and made sure it could meet the needs of the court by providing opportunities for hunting, pleasant lodgings, and keeping the abbot's cellars stocked with wine. Here are two such itineraries made by Henry III in the mid-13th century. There's Reading. Whenever the king went west, the journey from Westminster began with a trip to Reading. The Abbey, I'm sort of slotting in pretty views of Reading as I go. The Abbey was founded from Cluny in Burgundy and was the paradigm of a type of Benedictine observance that was famous for its fine buildings, rich furnishings, and elaborate sung liturgies. It and Reading was founded on the assumption that Christ, as the greatest of kings, deserved the best of everything. There was an alternative view, the opposite view, which was that monks should imitate the poverty of Christ and his apostles, and that was espoused by the Cistercians. And we shall see that Reading was at the forefront of the debate in the 12th century. At the end of its life, and this is one of a group of paintings commissioned by Hurry, the Woad man, to illustrate key events in the history of Reading. Reading's last abbot, Hugh Cook of Farringdon, was one of the few abbots, 3 abbots, who didn't accept Thomas Cromwell's measures willingly. He was executed horribly, and both he and his abbey church were systematically taken apart. The abbey's position in the middle of a growing town made it a valuable source of building stone. Under Edward VI, the choir of the abbey church was taken down, and stone and lead from the choir were used in the rebuilding of St Mary's, Reading. And in 1560, Queen Elizabeth granted much of it to the town council for repairing bridges. These repairs can still be seen under the town, covering sections of the River Kennet and the Holy Brook with reused vault ribs. At least 6 different rib profiles have been identified. Also, stone from the Lady Chapel was shipped to Windsor on the orders of Queen Mary around 1557 to build the poor knight's lodging. Now, the most interesting evidence we have about the 16th century dismantling of the fabric is a set of accounts from what we might call a closing down sale in 1549. What happened was that the abbey was demolished to order, and bits of it were sold off to private buyers. So, for example, paving tiles were sold at a fixed rate of 6 and 8 pence per thousand, which is, 3,000 for a pound, while other pieces were taken down as needed. There was an ironmonger from London, and he bought all the images and stones standing at the high altar for 46 shillings and 8 pence, while the cloister arcades were sold off in 2 lots for 40 shillings and 50 shillings respectively to a Mr. Sands and a Mr. Gray. What I'm showing you is Stukely's drawing of the cloister enclosure looking east towards the chapter house, with all its arcades missing. So, of course, they're missing. They've been shipped off somewhere. When in 1912, Charles Keyser discovered what turned out to be 15 cloister capitals decorating the flower beds of Home Park, Sonning, it soon became clear that this was part of one of these 2 lots. And what we're seeing here is Charles Keyser himself, 2 of the capitals, and he carted them all off to Burlington House to show them and to display them to the Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries, which was very nice of him. And what I'm showing you here is, in the course of Keyser's investigations into these wonderful stones that he'd found in the flower beds, he came across this arch, Shiplake house that's made up of 12th century voussoirs and a battlemented wall in which the merlons are made up of double springers from an arcade. So if you see them, yeah, we can see them here, and imagine an arch springing from each side. Sorry, imagine an arch springing from each side of the springer. Just to all of this material, certainly cloister arcade material, have been brought from an island in the Thames called Borough Marsh. And here's a sketch map to show you how these places are linked by the river. So there's the Abbey, there's the Thames, the Kennet, the Holy Brook, which we saw earlier. Borough Marsh is there, Shiplake House, and this is where Keyser found his capitals. So they're all made up they all come from Borough Marsh, but much to my shame and disgust, I've been unable to discover who owned Borough Marsh in the 12th century. Now, Charles Keyser presented his discoveries to the Society of Antiquaries in 1916, saying, "I hope that after this terrible war is at an end, to be allowed to make an investigation of this singular site, as I fancy some trifling investigations may yield interesting results." But he never returned. And it was after a second terrible war that the work was resumed under the leadership of a Polish war hero and escaped prisoner of war who set out in 1948 from Portman Square to lead the only archaeological dig ever to be undertaken by the Courtauld Institute of Art. The excavators, led by George Janetsky, was made up of postgraduates, librarians, and secretarial staff from the Institute. And they basically demolished a wall at Borough Marsh Farm with the permission of the owner, Wilfred Bowman, shown here in the centre, chatting to George Janetsky. They took what they found back to the Courtauld Institute and washed the stones in a sink, except for this, the coronation of the Virgin capital. And I show you the moment of its discovery, with George in the centre and Peter Lasco to his left. The oldest known example of this iconography in European sculpture, which George took home to wash in his own sink. To complete this part of the story, all of these carved stones ended up in the Reading Museum and Art Gallery and were the basis for the reconstruction of the cloister arcade by Stuart Harrison and myself in 2002. And here I'm showing you three ranges of the cloister arcade. You can see that basically that's a corner and that's a corner. There's a kind of double alternating system in which trefoil scallop capitals on polygonal shafts alternate with block capitals carved with foliage and figures on cylindrical shafts. The arches themselves, you have an arcade of chevron, an arcade of beakhead, and one arcade that has some boss decoration and some of the inhabited foliage decoration. You can also see that there's a triple shaft at each angle and a big angle springer at each angle, and two of these big angle springers survive. And that allows us really to put the arcade together and show which motifs in the arches were on each range. Our knowledge of the remainder of the abbey is based on what still stands on a series of antiquarian drawings and on a few excavations, mostly led by Cecil Slade in the 1970s. I've given you an aerial view of the site and superimposed a rough shape corresponding to the Abbey Church and the cloister here. What you've got is at the top left, the Forbury Gardens, which is a public park that covers the site of the nave of the church. At the far right over here is Reading Jail, a panopticon-like structure that covers the chancel of the church. The main buildings that you can actually see are the chapter house, which is there, and the south transept, which is there. The big building to the south, down here, is the dormitory and its undercroft. Here it is. This is the chapter house. This is the dormitory undercroft. And you can see it's a steep slope that's running down to the rear altar at the bottom, and the river. The river, I'm showing you the Kennet there, where it joins the Holy Brook. So the Holy Brook running into the Kennet, and the rear altar is on the left. Let's get back to the aerial view. The buildings over the crossing, this area, and the north transept are 19th century buildings. They Pugin's Catholic Church of St. James of 1840, and next to it his priest house, and then further over to the right the school, which is no longer a school, it's now a day nursery. But in fact, a good deal of the north transept still stands in the back garden of the priest's house. It's all rather cramped in there and overgrown. The area around the Catholic enclave is an unofficial car park, and there are two more chunks of north transept masonry standing in there. So what are we left with? Basically, we're left with the presbytery here and the nave here. The nave over to the left was the site of a siege in the Civil War, when a ditch and a rampart were dug across it. Early antiquarian views show this clearly enough. There we are. This is Henry Englefield's 1779 plan with east at the top. So you have to imagine it turned around through 90 degrees. And you can see what he found at the still standing south transept architecture. Here's the chapter house. Here's the dormitory undercroft. Here's the what remains of the north transept, and the ditch and the rampart running across here. in a typical 17th century kind of earthwork design. And here is Grimm's 1778 view of the northwest view, with a ditch in the foreground here. And because the church was pulled down so early, there are really no antiquarian views that show very much of the nave. The best we can do is this. And what you're seeing here is Martin Reddleson's view of 1768. So in the centre, the south nave wall is the big main structure, not standing for very much of its length. To the left of the nave wall, you can see the inner south transept, which is still standing over here. And in the distance here, the Lady Chapel wall, which is not there any longer. So what you can see through the hole in the nave wall is the entrance to the chapter house, the triple opening, and on the far right, the wall of the refectory. Of course, the dark line in the foreground marks the Civil War ditch. If you travel to this spot, ignoring the reactions of the 18th century horsemen to the sudden appearance of a temporal anomaly, and then travel forward in time 250 years, the view you will see is this. In other words, the houses at the east end of Abbott's Walk merge seamlessly with what remains of the south nave aisle wall, indicating that the line of the aisle wall is preserved in the facade of this 1840s terrace. As for the presbytery, the standing remains are best preserved on the south side. On the right is the aisle wall, and at the far end, the brick wall of the former jail, closed in 2013. Latest I've heard is that it might be turned into an arts venue. But as this view shows, the east end of the presbytery, including the high altar, is under the prison. That doesn't mean we don't know what it looked like, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Meanwhile, the wall on the left of this slide belongs to the former Catholic church, Catholic school, now the Forbury Gardens Day Nursery. And you can see that this wall stands on the line of the South Presbytery arcade, because what we have here is one of the arcade pier bases still in place. As you can see, the base of a cylindrical pier with a small respond on the aisle side to carry a vault rib. Now, the form of the eastern termination was revealed by Cecil Slade, who obtained permission to excavate under the prison in 1971 to 73, which revealed the north side of an ambulatory with radiating chapels, a large central one that we can just see a part of, flanked by two smaller ones. In combination with the surviving chapels on the south transept, this is the inner south transept chapel on the left, which survives to the top of the windows, and to the right of it, the outer south transept chapel with walls just standing for a foot or so. So we have an eastern arm arrangement with a total of 7 chapels, like this. which has similarities to various English great churches of the period. I should just add that this kind of plan defines a route for pilgrims to visit altars and venerate relics without disturbing the monastic liturgy. This relates Reading to Tours, Limoges, Caen, Toulouse, and ultimately to Santiago de Compostela itself, destination of pilgrims who wish to venerate the high value in terms of indulgence or remissionary of purgatory time, apostolic relic of St. James the Great. And it can't be a coincidence that Reading also claimed a relic of St. James, his hand, presented by Henry I's daughter, the Empress Matilda, along with a rich collection of some 230 precious items, not all given by Matilda, but some of them were, but things that were gathered between the foundation in 1121 and the end of the 12th century. So pretty quick for such a big collection of relics. So who was this guy? Well, James the Great was the brother of the Apostle John and the son of Zebedee, a fisherman, and Salome, arguably at a stretch, the Virgin Mary's sister. James and John may thus have been first cousins of Jesus on their mother's side. James was executed in Jerusalem with the sword on the orders of King Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, in AD 42 or possibly 44. And this is the modern shrine that you will see if you go to Santiago de Compostela. The official line, synthesized from various legends dating back to the 7th century, was that the apostle had preached in Spain during his lifetime, and that at his death, 2 of his disciples, Athanasius and Theodore, had taken his body to Spain, landing at Padron on the Galician coast. The body was then taken inland to Compostela and buried, and later the 2 disciples were buried nearby, and the discovery of graves that fitted the story, in other words, 3 bodies, was taken as evidence that it was true, and the success of Santiago as a pilgrimage destination testifies to its general acceptance. Despite this, the tale is inherently unlikely. And another story seems to have much more going for it. In this account, James was not only executed in Jerusalem, but was buried there too. In the late 4th century, Bishop Heliodorus of Altino visited his shrine and took away an arm, which was given to Torcello Cathedral for safekeeping. There it stayed until the visit of Adalbert, Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen, in the 1040s. Now, he was a member of the court of Emperor Henry III, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was concerned about the number of rivals to the papacy and determined to sort it all out. Adalbert quite fancied this relic. With the power of the emperor behind him, he had no difficulty in obtaining it. When Adalbert died in 1072, his treasury contained very little except books, vestments, and relics, and these were seized by the emperor, Henry IV, who passed them to his son and successor, Henry V, at his death. In 1114, Henry V married Matilda, the 12-year-old daughter of King Henry I of England. And when she was widowed in 1925, her opportunities in Germany were extremely limited. So she went back home, taking with her her personal collection of jewels, her own imperial regalia, 2 of Henry's crowns, and the hand of St. James. Matilda asked her father, King Henry I, to give the hand to his foundation of Reading Abbey, which he did, but it soon disappeared again. In 1135, Henry died. This is Henry I of England. And in the following year, the relic was borrowed by Henry of Blois, Abbot of Glastonbury and Bishop of Winchester, and the younger brother of the new king, Stephen. And he could not be persuaded to give it back until 1155, so he'd had it for 20 years. It was certainly back at the Abbey by 1161, when it was mentioned in an indulgence issued by Theobald, Bishop of London, as being there. Thereafter, it was mentioned occasionally throughout the pre-Reformation period, most notably perhaps in a manuscript of circa 1200 that describes several miracles, 28 miracles, mostly cures worked by the hand. It was recorded in the relic list, now in the British Library, as the 1190 list, as Manus Sancti Jacobi cum carne et ossibus, the hand of St. James with flesh and bones. And the final mention was in the short list of relics made in 1538 by Dr. London at an early stage in the dissolution of the house, but not taken away. Then, in 1786, workmen were digging the foundations for Reading Jail, and they discovered a left hand in a wall at the east end of the Abbey. And this hand eventually found its way via a Reading museum, a private collector, and a couple of Catholic enthusiasts to the Roman Catholic Church of Marlow in Buckinghamshire, where, to be honest, it remained as something of an embarrassment, what with the pilgrimage trade to Santiago and everything. So much so that the incumbent and the Catholic diocese fairly recently decided to have it radiocarbon dated. And in 2018, the Oxford University Research Laboratory came up with a probable date range of 987 to 1150 for the death of its owner. So it's clear that the hand didn't belong to the arm collected from Jerusalem by Heliodorus in the 4th century, taken to Altino and transferred to Torcello in the 7th century. It's just not old enough. It may just be the hand that left Torcello in the 1040s, in which case the switch could have been made by Bishop Vitalis of Torcello. This would make the relic a rather modern one at the time the exchange was made, presumably a recent addition from Jerusalem. If it isn't, there seems no reason to suspect any chicanery while the hand was in the possession of Archbishop Adalbert or the imperial treasury, and we can be confident that Matilda thought she had the genuine relic. Similarly, a substitution seems unlikely while the hand was in Reading, except for one occasion. The period from 1136 to 1155, when it was borrowed by Henry of Blois. He could certainly have exchanged the hand for a relic of less value from Winchester or Glastonbury. The hand was a crucial part of Reading's history, but we seem to have reached it through a digression from our discussion of the plan of the church. When we come to the elevation, things become more problematic, but based on what we can see, a block reconstruction is at least possible. Where we hit a bit of a stumbling block is in the detail of the elevation. because all of the ashlar facing has been quarried away. We can see where it was, and also the ghosts of responds, string coursers, and arch orders in the walls. The tallest of these walls is the west wall of the south transept, where the marks of ashlar block removal are visible, along with the division into two bays by responds. The windows we see are the lower windows of the elevation, and the original interior wall was originally at least twice as high. So we've sketched it in. We can see where it was. You can see that I've opted for a giant order elevation, by which I mean that the pilasters continued up the wall, enclosing the upper windows here rather than the lower windows. This was suggested for Reading by Richard Halsey as early as 1990, and I found nothing to contradict the interpretation and much to support it. It's compulsory for architectural historians to show this building whenever they mention a giant order. It gives a very clear idea of what a giant order looks like, and it simultaneously reminds us that the giant order is a Roman imperial form, which makes it especially appropriate for a royal foundation, like Reading. The story of the giant order in England is a very complicated and confusing one. But in brief, we have ambiguous evidence for one in the chancel of Tewkesbury Abbey in the 1090s, but the earliest definite survivals seem to be the naves of Dunstable Priory and Romsey. Dunstable was an Augustinian house built 10 years after Reading by Henry I. The clerestory is gone, so we only have the arcade and gallery openings converted to windows in the elevation. So you see how the responds continue up the wall, enclosing the gallery stage rather than enclosing the arcade stage. And the arcade itself is set back, which, with the eye of faith, perhaps that's what one can imagine if the ashlar was put back on the walls at Reading Abbey. The nunnery of Romsey is similar. It's the royal house. The first abbess was a granddaughter of Alfred the Great, and the royal link was maintained into the 12th century. Henry I's wife, Edith Matilda, a daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland, was educated there. And the rebuilding of Romsey in the 1130s and 40s is connected with Henry of Blois, brother of King Stephen. So it would be reasonable to build it in imitation of King Henry's great burial church at Reading. To conclude, as a historian of sculpture, I should like to make a few points about what we know of the sculpture of the cloister. At least one complete arcade of the cloister was covered with these chevrons. It's what we see at Reading is something new. It seems certain that beakheads and the Winchester acanthus was first seen here in great quantities, and that the imagery was designed to instill fears of damnation in the monks of the abbey. I mean, I don't know what you want to make of it, but you must remember that this was all garishly painted originally. A couple of the beakheads from Reading Cloister here, three: a bird, a demonic face, or two demonic faces, and in the flickering candlelight carried by a suggestible monk, these unearthly images could conjure up nightmares, especially at the matins, midnight matins. Then you've got this tangled foliage. The message of the foliage and figural arches was more subtle. A large proportion of the arcade was covered with this kind of foliage, either issuing from the mouths of beasts or inhabited by dragons or predatory birds or lost souls who appear to be trapped in it. You might have wondered why so much of Romanesque sculpture depicts foliage in knots or tangles. We call it palmettes or Winchester acanthus and derive the motifs from Roman forms. But it seems clear enough that Romanesque carvers didn't use it just because they liked trees and shrubs. Tangled foliage was widely used in the 12th century as a metaphor for hell or for the snares and temptations of the world. This is most obviously the case for the Herefordshire school of sculpture, where the hell from which Christ pulls Adam on the Eardsley font is shown not as flames, but as foliage. At Reading too, the entire east range of the cloister was a tunnel of tangled foliage, sometimes trapping figures in its coils and sometimes issuing from the mouths of fierce beasts. Every discussion of cloister iconography takes as its starting point Bernard of Clairvault's well-known diatribe from his Apologia ad Guilielmum about monstrous and secular imagery in a cloister. And in most discussions of it, he's psychoanalyzed far beyond the words he actually wrote. The specific subjects he singled out for complaint were apes, lions, centaurs, composite human and animal creatures, tigers, soldiers, and hunting scenes. Subjects relevant to monks who had entered the house as adults after a life of military service and travel. What I've shown you, I hope you'll agree that the cloister of Reading Abbey was not a place where Bernard would have felt at home. And as it was the main Cluniac foundation of its date in England, this hardly seems surprising. In fact, a polemic written in opposition to the Abbot of Clairvault's Apologia was circulating in England very soon after Bernard's production of his revised text in 1125-6. This is the so-called Reprehensio, a systematic response to Bernard's denunciation of traditional monasticism, and especially the Cluniac observance. But although it's 12,000 words long, it's an incomplete copy, addressing less than half of Bernard's points and ending in the middle of a sentence. That might not matter so much to us, were it not that what survives deals only with matters of diet and dress. The sections that doubtless answered the Abbot of Clairvault's criticisms of the church and the liturgy are missing. It'd be nice if we could prove it was written in Reading, and it probably was. From internal evidence, we know that the author was a Cluniac who was in England in the late 1120s. He was in a position of authority in a monastery, and most probably an abbot. His background lay in France because he displayed a detailed knowledge of French monasticism that would be impossible for somebody who was brought up in England. And finally, he was a man of great authority and learning who was not frightened by the Abbot of Clairvault's reputation. This narrows the field rather a lot. In fact, to either Hugh of Amiens, Abbot of Reading 1125-30, or his successor Ansgar 1130-35. It seems certain, therefore, that it was produced at Reading And while the fragment that remains to us once the crucial section on cloister iconography is clear enough that someone in authority there was concerned to position himself and his monastery in opposition to Bernard of Clairvaux. The argument that the author could have adduced is well known. These monstrous and demonic images were to be read as a metaphor for the traps of the devil with which the world was filled. This was imagery aimed specifically at monks. At Reading, where the foundation charter forbade child ablation, the monks were men who had led a full and active life before entering the monastery in their maturity. And perhaps such men needed reminders of what the world was really like, lest they should lapse into wistful reminiscence of illusory pleasures. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. If you just downsize your screen.
Yeah.
And then we'll come to some questions. That's fantastic. Then people can see you properly. Excellent. And actually, and then sorry, stop sharing, I should say, if you just click the the share screen button at the bottom. Brilliant. Well, that was a really fascinating talk. You covered so much, I have to say, in your time, from the plan, the layout, reconstructing that of the monastery, through to the specific architectural details, the arcade of the cloister, and then for me, slightly left field, the hand as well. So I mean, I think that could just definitely generate some questions. So if you've got a question for Ron, do put it into the chat box. While people are digesting that, I'll ask the first question, or first couple of questions maybe. And I'm afraid, as people might expect, I was kind of really fascinated by the afterlife of the cloistral arcade, and how it was moved. I mean, I had two questions really. Is that first, you mentioned that there was the sale, of the goods and parts of the architecture was in 1549, if I heard that right. Which is 10 years after the closure of the house, so that's a little bit of a gap compared to some of the sales of these houses. I mean, my first question is, what was happening to Reading Abbey in the immediate period after the dissolution? Was it being mothballed? Do we know what its immediate?
Well, yeah, it was a royal abbey, and after it had after the dissolution, it still remained as a royal palace. Parts of it were converted, and new stables were built. So it was still actually in use for quite a while. It wasn't until about 10 years later that they actually started to demolish it.
So that's interesting in one part. But the thing that really struck me is because we have lots of sales from different sites where bits of architecture are sold to various people and they kind of just disappear into the ether. Very occasionally, like Dale Abbey, we have bits of cloister that go into parish churches, and that sort of thing. But what struck me was the wholesale movement of a large portion of the cloister into the location. I can't remember is it Borough Island?
Borough Marsh.
Borough Marsh. And that's really fascinating, because in some ways the cloistral arcade is the most useless part of the architecture to a Tudor to reuse, yet somebody has clearly carefully moved it and then it must have been reconstructed or must have been maintained in a way for all those bits then to be found, centuries later, admittedly in flower beds. But I find that really, really fascinating, and I wonder if that's related to actually some of that imagery that you were talking about, that it actually spoke perhaps to a 16th century audience as being really special. And not just
yeah. I mean, most of the stuff that was shift. This was kind of useless stuff, and actually, reading the accounts is fascinating, and it's fascinating to me especially because so much of it seems to be a material that would be useful or be of interest to people with some sort of aesthetic sense. I mean, for example, there's another entry that fairly clearly describes somebody buying a corbel table. Now, you wouldn't buy a corbel table for anything except to look at the sculpture. And the same goes for the cloister arcades. As if you want building stone, it's the last thing you'd take.
So I think it's really. I'd love to know who owned Borough Marsh at that time.
Well, so should I. One of these guys, Mr. Gray, was a fairly well-known poet at the time. I kind of wondered, is it him? But I could not find anything. I need a better historian, actually, rather than an art historian.
Well, fantastic. I mean, we need more excavation in the marsh as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of it was taken away and shipped down the river by these guys in the end of the 19th century. And the story about them is that there were youths in a punt who were basically nicking the stones and re-erecting them from Borough Marsh as at Shiplake House, and some of them made their way further down the river, up the river to Sonning. But yeah, it's very interesting. George Janetsky, whom I knew fairly well, was tried to persuade the then owner of Shiplake House to give the stones to the museum, but he wouldn't have it because he said they were nothing to do with Reading Abbey. They were from a chapel on Borough Marsh, and he was perfectly entitled to keep them himself. Fortunately, his successor took a different view.
No, fascinating, brilliant. I'm afraid, I think, because we've just gone past 8 o'clock, so we have passed our allotted time. But that I know time flies when you're listening to an enjoyable talk, and I really, really enjoyed that, and that was fascinating. So
well, thank you.
Well, no, absolutely. Well, thank you. So I would just like to thank Ron again for his talk. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And just another reminder that our next talk is on the 8th of August, when John Wand will be talking about 11th and 12th century parish churches. Oh, Elizabeth is waving her hand, I can see. I don't know if that's, oh, it's a clap. Sorry, I thought it was a wave. I haven't got my glasses on. I took my glasses off because I'm vain, so I can't see the computer screen. Sorry. Well, I would like to echo Elizabeth's clap with a big society clap for you, Ron, and hope we will see all of you again shortly. So thank you to our speaker and thank you to our attendees for joining us. Good night.
Good night.